Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Ball from the University of Maryland.
And I'm Joe Post, now on assignment to the University of South Florida from the FAA.
We are your hosts for this NEXTOR webinar series on the pandemic and air transportation. Note that this webinar is being recorded. We will make it available on the NEXTOR website. For background, NEXTOR was established in 1996 as an FAA Center of Excellence in Aviation Operations Research. It initially included 4 core universities, but over time expanded. In 2011, it transitioned to NEXTOR 2, an FAA consortium in aviation operations research that included 8 universities: Georgia Tech, George Mason University, MIT, The Ohio State University, Purdue, UC Berkeley, University of Maryland, and Virginia Tech. It recently was renewed once more, becoming NEXTOR 3. We are pleased to bring together academic researchers with industry and government leaders to examine the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on air transportation. We are examining the crisis through several lenses. The first webinar considered the airline perspective. The second webinar looks at the crisis from the airport point of view.
We have with us today 3 distinguished speakers: Matthew Cornelius, Executive Vice President of ACI North America; Patty Clark, Chief Strategy Officer in the Aviation Department at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey; and Solomon Wong, President and CEO of InterVista's Consulting Group. We also have a panel of academic researchers from the NEXTOR University Consortium. In addition to Professor Ball, we are joined today by Amadeo Odani, Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics and of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT, and Yasenka Rakas, a researcher and lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Berkeley.
We will begin with short talks by each of our 3 invited guests. After each talk, we will take a few questions. Then, after all the speakers have concluded, we will have a panel discussion.
I will moderate the panel. The panelists will be able to ask questions directly of our speakers. You in the audience will be able to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. Our apologies in advance if we are unable to address all questions. As before, we will conduct a series of audience polls during the webinar using the Zoom polling feature. As you will see, the questions deal with your perceptions of the risk of flying right now and your likelihood to fly in the future. The results will be presented right after the polling.
With that, let's get started with our first poll. So the poll is, which do you feel carries the most health risk? Traveling to and from airports, proceeding through the origin and destination airports, including waiting in the gate area, boarding and disembarking the aircraft, the flight itself, i.e. sitting on an aircraft during a flight of, say, 2 hours, all are about the same. Okay, please go ahead and start voting. Okay, just wait a couple more seconds. All right, why don't we look at the results? Okay, so we see the most votes were obtained by the flight itself. That was 38% of you indicated that was the riskiest. The second most the second choice, actually almost tied between, the second choice was all or about the same, and the third was proceeding through origin and destination airports, including the waiting in the gate area. So the airport itself comes in comes in second to the to the flight itself. And, many people think all aspects are fairly close. So I think it is clearly important from the success of air travel that the airports themselves, address safety issues. Okay, after that, let's move on to our first speaker, who is Matt Cornelius from ACI North America.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm just gonna grab my presentation. Let's see. There we go. Hopefully that's coming up. All right. Well, as Mike said there, I'm Matt Cornelius. I'm the Executive Vice President at ACI North America, and really glad to be here. I'd like to take a moment to thank the FAA for inviting me, and also to thank FAA staff for all that they've done for the system and for airports. There we go. Over this crisis. Just a little bit about ACI real quick. We represent airport operators in the United States and Canada. That's about 400 airports. We also have members that do business at airports, is about 450 of those. So we have a very good representation of the airport community. And we're one of the 5 regions of the ACI global organization, which does the same job around the world. And we've been working with them even more than ever, given this is a global pandemic. So just to set the stage for everybody, and we're all well familiar with what the devastating traffic impacts of the pandemic has been, but I think this data set, which is essentially TSA screenings per day, gives a really good visualization of the cliff our industry has gone off in March, starting in March 2020. And as you can see, there was a lot of debate early on about what the recovery would look like, but the swoosh, the Nike swoosh, is probably a pretty good analogy. And I would say that the slope of the return has been unsatisfactory, certainly to industry participants, and we're continuing to look for trends. Although, I would say that there is some bit of hope that, given the fact that there's virtually no containment of the virus, we have almost 30% of the traffic back, and that's largely leisure and domestic traffic. I mean, international traffic is still virtually non-existent. One of the other, I guess, bright spots, there's very few of them. This Monday was the best Monday in the system, at least in terms of TSA screenings, since March 16th. So again, we're getting better, but there's a long way to go. One of the interesting facts that we've been looking at, there's a very strong correlation between local policies, quarantines, these types of things, and the drop in traffic. So you can see here, the largest amounts of change are related to places that have very strict rules and quarantines and that sort of thing in the environment. Also, we've seen that large hubs have reported the largest capacity loss so far in 2020. But that being said, the CARES Act actually enabled the Secretary of Transportation to enact certain measures that perhaps ameliorated or blunted perhaps the effect on smaller and non-hub airports. So it's hard to say exactly what the cause is there, although large urban centers tended to be where a lot of infections happened, and also where some of the measures were more strict, so that could perhaps affect why this is the case. I think similarly, we're likely to see a faster recovery at large hubs versus the smaller airports, which is, I think, a growing and a serious concern for our air transportation system moving forward as a recovery comes about, and something that we'll be working on certainly as a matter of policy. So here's our forecast, the top line numbers. no question, this is significant. I would say this is highly conservative in terms of the loss. Almost 600 million passengers gone over the next 18 months or so. $23 billion in airport revenue, at least. I mean, this is, again, updated at the end of July. The impacts of sort of this quasi second wave or spike that we had in the beginning of July, I think, isn't really settled out in this data. So the bottom line is it's very, very bad and likely to be worse than this shows. And of course, we're very thankful for the actions of Congress and the federal government to support the airport industry and the air transportation system. The CARES Act grants, which I'll talk a little bit more in the future, were a lifeline. And you can see here, really, by and large, for airports, the money that they received through this federal grant program was helpful in getting through the worst part of this crisis. So, on average, there are 4 or 5 months worth of money for airports, and there are some that got more, but by and large, just a relatively short amount of time of relief. And of course, we're actually coming up on those 4 or 5 months, so we are hearing from a number of airports that do need more money, and certainly we're forecasting 23 billion. This was 10 billion, so there's an obvious delta that still exists. And one of the structural challenges of the airport industry that existed before the pandemic was a huge amount of debt. Given the way the airport system is funded in the United States, we rely heavily on the bond market and debt. And so you can see we're probably past $100 billion in overall debt outstanding at airports in the United States, and that translates into approaching $8 billion a year in debt service payments. So, we went into this in a burdened situation, a huge cutback in passenger traffic and revenues has this, a very quick impact to the overall picture for American airports. So that was a big part of the arguments that we made to Congress and the advocacy that we had regarding the first round of aid and CARES Act. $10 billion, as I said before, that went to airports. Eliminated the local match for the FY20 AIP program, which was largely underway, and then added through basically 3 sort of formulas, disbursements to airports. The law also did include a requirement that those airports accepting the CARES money would have to maintain 90% of their workforce through December 31st. And we're, of course, adhering to that law, but I know, again, as airports kind of run out of that relief money, everyone's looking at how to restructure and be able to weather the storm. As I mentioned before, I mean, this money was a bridge to get over the initial devastating impacts of the pandemic on the system. And one of the things I'd want to emphasize here in terms of the program mechanics, the way it's set up, is that it's a reimbursable program. So there was recently a report out of a group here in Washington that said airports aren't spending their money, airports and transit agencies. And I do want to dispel the fact that it is a reimbursable program. So even though I think it was over $1 billion as of June 30th had been spent, there was $9.5 billion that was obligated. And debt service is one of the key spends for an airport of this money, and those are basically twice annual payments and can be timed. So airports may have a July 1st debt payment or September 1st. In any event, they're using that money, and then we'll get reimbursed by the federal government through the CARES grant. So it's fair to say this money is needed. It will be used. We need more money. It's just a matter of how the program's set up. And of course, as I said, when everybody was discussing this in as it started, basically, the forecasts have gone way downhill. So it's way worse than expected, and more help is needed. One of the things I think as an industry we're really focused on, in addition to sort of the relief side of it, is how do we coalesce together and come up with an approach on the recovery. And that's really been an industry-wide effort, global, all the way around, starting with ICAO and their CART efforts. Our world organization came out with a document with guidance, and of course, recently the U.S. government's published the Runway to Recovery. We stood up what's called the Airport Industry Recovery Advisory Panel. It's a panel of members. We have 18 different committees within ACI North America that focus on the technical, functional areas of airports, and they're all doing their very specific and technical things, but not necessarily coordinated. So the advisory panel was stood up to help in the COVID situation, to bring those groups together. There's a lot of cross-cutting issues, and this group basically coordinates that, and it acts as a sounding board for them, and with the principles of, obviously minimizing the spread of COVID-19, creating confidence in the system. And I think the poll was very interesting and consistent with what we've understood, that we have a lot of work to do in that area. Consistency, harmonization, standardization of measures is really important. And then, of course, streamlining that across the system is the goal. So that's our focus. They issued a report at the end of June, 52 areas of focus and recommendations, and we've broken those into different timelines. We also have our own separate position on facial coverings and passenger health screenings, which we had to establish given the nature of the argument that was out there and the timeliness that we needed those positions. So key recommendations from the advisory panel: obviously more money. I think I've hit on that pretty hard. Some of the other agencies, particularly CBP, NTSA, fee funded. So drop in passenger traffic creates huge budget problems for them. Trying to get away from handling documents, touching kiosks, that sort of thing, looking at contactless technologies in the short term, modifying facilities, plexiglass barriers, creating the physical distancing that's needed, all the things that you'd expect in the short term to make sure that customers feel safe and comfortable in the environment. And lastly, really, I've always seen this as a dual track effort, messaging about the safety of the system, and we created sort of a template program that airports can use to push that on. It's called Ready for Every Journey. The whole presentation has it plastered all over. 4 key message areas: again, that air travel is safe, that the airports are working hard to make sure that we're doing everything to minimize the spread, that we're working with airlines to create price and service competition, and lastly, that airports are really key economic engines for the recovery. We're going to be a central part of that. Here's a couple shots of it. There's actually a map of the customer experience at the airport and all the things that you need that may have changed or you need to remember. You can see in the corner there, our member airports can adapt the messaging to their own situation, but we did want to give a toolkit for our members to be able to use to amplify the message that we're really on top of this. We also did some surveys. So, we found a high level of trust among passengers that airports are doing this. The facial coverings and visible actions that can be seen by passengers are really impactful. And again, that idea of consistency and harmonization of rules and approaches is really important to them. From the medium term, it's obviously airports going to have to cut back, so they're working on how best to make those recommendations. Queuing is going to have to change, so there's some long-term implications there. Insurance, obviously, and what have we learned about business continuity as a result of this? I mean, everything else we've experienced in the past has been much more short-term. This is a long-duration, serious event. And will change the way we understand business continuity. And lastly, probably less energy going to this, and some of it's kind of our normal work anyway. But really looking at the future of biometrics, PFCs. That's a key part. Although with passengers at least temporarily changing. It's certainly not as important right now, but in the long term, we got into this event because our situation is exacerbated by $100 billion worth of debt. I think we need to think about avoiding that in the future. Climate change is another key dynamic, and then all of the other kind of big topics there. So they're a huge part of what we're doing now, but there's a long way to go. I think working together as an aviation community is really important, and hopefully before long we'll be on the higher end of that Nike swoosh. But I appreciate being able to sort of set the stage here, and look forward to your questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We will take a few questions for Matt before moving on to the next speaker. I did have one question for you, Matt. One of your slides, you showed revenue down in 2020, revenue down less than ops, but then in 2021, the forecast revenue down more than ops. What's going on there?
Let me go back to it and make sure I understand the. Yeah. So I mean the forecast includes. That's a good question. Actually, let me think about that for a second. My guess is that a lot of the revenue actually comes from different sources. So there's different levels of impact there. You have connecting traffic, that sort of thing. So they don't necessarily use parking and other parts of the airport. So there is a little bit of a difference in between the two. They're not directly correlated, essentially.
Thanks. I see one of our audience members has asked about data sharing and interoperability as a long-term consideration. What data are you referring to?
Sure. Well, that's still in development, number one. But there is a lot of information and data that goes on in the airport environment, and so we don't necessarily have a lot of those systems talking to each other as it is today, and certainly as biometrics and other technologies come on, the data collection, data ownership is going to become more important. So I mean, it can be a range. I mean, certainly airlines have a lot of their proprietary information, but we have airports are huge commercial centers, and we can gain a lot of power through advertising, for example, being able to know how passengers are using the terminal, and in terms of interoperability, you have systems and like the FIS, the kiosks or mobile passports, something like that, where you may have different vendors providing the service. What we don't want to see in the future is proprietary solutions come on board that don't allow for easy swap out or multiple customer touch points, right? So that's where that's going. Again, the long-term considerations are sort of on the horizon. We're so busy with the immediate how to respond to this that these are more notional at this point.
Thanks. Well, Mike, I think in order to keep us on schedule, why don't we proceed with the next poll?
Okay, so the next poll is, who do you think should take responsibility for health checks? For example, temperature screening at the airport. Should it be the airport operator? Should it be each individual airline? Or should it be the TSA or the federal government? A couple more seconds. Okay, why don't we go ahead and close the poll? So 49% said it should be the federal government, and 35% the airport operator, and 17% each individual airline. And I think, of course, the TSA has shied away from doing these things, but I think, probably a significant motivator there is that you want a consistent, so if the airport operator or the TSA, the federal government, then it's consistent across all airlines, all airports. If it's just the airport operator, it might not be consistent. It's consistent across the airport, but not across all airports. So I think those are probably things that drove those answers, I would say. Okay, so our next speaker is Patty Clark from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Joe and the FAA and NEXTOR for the invitation. I'm really pleased that you've invited an airport operator to speak directly and candidly about the impacts of the pandemic on our system and what our response has been to that. In the last seminar, you heard from IATA and A4A about system-wide, what the impacts were, and quite honestly, the impacts were sobering. Matt reinforced that today when he talked about what the revenue impacts are to airports in the U.S. and North America. So I'm going to bring you down to the airport level, and we're going to just explain what we're seeing, what we're feeling, and what we're doing about it. So if we can have the next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Port Authority, we operate the bridges and tunnels between New York and New Jersey. We operate the ports, the bus terminal, the World Trade Center site, and the 5 airports that you see on this map. We run the gamut of airport types, large hub, small hub, GA. So we appreciate the challenges that each of them experience, and they are different. So from JFK, which is an international gateway to the world, in 2019, our 62 million passengers actually international outnumbered domestic. January and February numbers exceeded our forecast. March wasn't even that bad because of all the repatriation flights, but since then, with various travel restrictions, international traffic has hemorrhaged and domestic is not that much better. It's a slot-controlled airport, and the use it or lose it requirement has been waived. So through the end of October, which has had an impact on operations, which are down by almost 60%, just astonishing. You go over to Newark, where we had 46 million passengers. It's the 12th busiest airport in the United States last year. It's a hub for United, a growing service from LCCs and UCCs. And it had robust international service that has all but completely retreated significantly. We're in construction on a new Terminal 1 to replace Terminal A, and we were able to continue with that work throughout the pandemic, which has been one of the benefits of having a downturn in traffic. It's a level 2 airport, so there are operational limitations, but these two have been waived, protecting the carriers that had served there. LaGuardia is our miracle. It's one of the most productive airports in the world per acre. It's 680 acres, pumped a record number of 31 million passengers in 19. And we were in major reconstruction of the airport. 80% of the roadways were replaced, not once, but sometimes several times. There were 2 new terminals under construction, all of which continued during the pandemic. It's a domestic airport with some Canadian service. It's also slot controlled. It has a very unique schedule. At 6 a.m., the schedule goes from 0 to the high 70s. It's like a mesa for 16 hours and then comes back down sharply at 9:59 p.m. Today, however, the schedule is averaging 75% of what it was last year. I used the word astonishing before. This is really astonishing. I mean, I'm running out of adjectives to describe impact. We opened the head house for Terminal B and another concourse a few weeks ago. It's featured in a safety video that I'm going to give you access to at the end of this presentation. And Delta took full advantage of the drop in traffic to accelerate the construction of their terminal at the other end of the airport. If you recall, this is This is the airport that Vice President Biden referred to as the third world airport. I do have to go on record of saying is that was part of his stump speech when talking about airports that he used all over this country, but for some reason when it was used at LaGuardia, it stuck and got a lot of resonance, but it also got us 2 brand new terminals that we're going to enjoy. And the interesting thing about what's happening when you hear about Terminal 1 at Newark and the 2 terminals at LaGuardia, when the traffic does return, many of those people are going to meet brand new state-of-the-art terminals and airports. And so that is, we're trying to keep those projects going as much as possible. So in addition, we have a 4th commercial airport. We operate a small regional airport in upstate New York called New York Stewart International. It's the gateway to the Hudson Valley. And for those of you who are not familiar, it's probably one of the most beautiful places in the United States. It's filled with history, filled with just beautiful topography. I welcome you there. It is a low-cost international gateway to the greater New York City area that was proven by the Norwegian service. They unfortunately last year pulled all that service out and moved it to JFK, but it does prove that it can attract international passengers, and we are building a FIS in order to accommodate that, which we anticipate in the future. One of the things we talked a little bit about the CARES Act as it pertains to airports, but there were CARES Act provisions that pertaining to airlines that actually had impact on airports, and this is an example. Any carrier that took CARES Act money had certain requirements about them keeping their staff through the end of September. They also had a requirement that they had to serve any region that they had served to prior. My 5 airports, plus White Plains and Islip on Long Island, were all considered the New York region. And so Stewart was really harmed by that. And Stewart lost all service by carriers with the exception of Allegiant. So there were times in this period where we were down to 0 scheduled operations at that airport. But I'm happy to say that yesterday American resumed service, and they're going 7 days a week. And we expect the additional carriers to come back over the next few months. So things are definitely picking up there. Teterboro is our GA airport. It is I believe it was the 2nd busiest GA airport in the nation. It has a fraction of that traffic now, a little over 50%. Interesting phenomenon, particularly early in the pandemic, and this was reinforced by NetJets, that they were seeing a lot of uptick in their product for a limited amount of activity that had been business travelers were now families and leisure travelers. And this is at a time when people were not confident of airports, airlines, or anything else, so they felt much more comfortable in a private jet situation. And we've seen that too. The business traveler has been replaced by families flying for leisure, but we are slowly starting to see some business traffic come back. The agency as a whole reported $777 million in revenue losses in the first 6 months of the year. And we expect, unfortunately, that number to grow to $3 billion between March of 2020 and March of 2022. A good portion of that is aviation. In this time, the department held 28 stakeholder group meetings with airport tenants, carriers, vendors, permittees, and countless more one-on-ones to understand their financial situation and for us to give an opportunity to explain ours. We made operational cuts to coincide with the passenger levels. I mean, for example, when we didn't have passengers parking in our parking lots right across the street from the terminals, we allowed airport employees to park there. And then we didn't have to bus them from other parts of the airport, saving them money, saving us money. We gave relief where we could. We deferred certain payments. We changed the MAG, the minimum annual guarantee, to a percentage for our concessionaires. And while we are very grateful for the $450 million in CARES Act money that we received, we work very hard to figure out a way to share the benefit of that relief money with our partners. And I will say this, I'm even more sad because it represents just 3 months of operating expense for us, not 3 years, not 7 years. I don't even make the average of large hubs, but it is helpful. I'm thankful, but I'm also crossing my fingers that Congress considers the additional funding package that Matt referred to earlier. I'm just going to briefly give you some numbers. The week of April 14th, the average, we were down 96% of our traffic. And on April 16th, we were down 99% of our traffic. I'm very happy to report by the week of the 6th of July, we were up to 92%. Now we're up to about 85%. We're still below what Matt talked about, where 30% of the traffic is back for other folks. I'm still at 15, but we're again, the number, the trend, the trajectory is going in the right direction. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm not going to read each of these because you'll get to see them, but the point is, when there was an action, the Port Authority took swift action. JFK was one of the first airports back in January, actually, that became the quote, the funnel airport, where airlines coming from China, mainland China, could enter enter the United States. We actually, within days of the first positive reported case in the state of Washington, we asked all of our terminal operators to update their contagious disease plan. I'm going to make that phone go away. Hold on a second. Sorry. In February, Newark was added to the list, and so I didn't make the phone go away, so I'm going to keep on going. Newark was added to the list, as were European countries. So at this point, we went back to our carriers and we asked them to meet all of the CDC cleanliness standards that were established at the time. Between March 1st and March 4th, the first cases were identified in New York State and New Jersey. March 4th, we issued additional guidance to our terminal operators, asking them to, instructing them about the sanitizing stations, the frequency of cleaning, the products that they should use, etc. April 4th, we made the masks required for all airport employees, and then eventually made it for anyone coming into our terminal. I already mentioned about the peak of our traffic down coincided with the peak of the virus hitting New York. We were the first airport to restrict access to the terminals to ticketed passengers and employees and others conducting business. And as our numbers went down, precipitously actually, we watched as cases surged in the other parts of the country, particularly the South and the West. The response was the governors of New York, New Jersey implemented a 14-day quarantine from those states. And I'll talk about that in about 2 seconds. But one of the things we're also doing, in addition to all of our action plan, we are doing some pilots. Express Check is testing a pilot for airport employees at JFK, first in the nation. It's going to be expanded to our other 2 airports. We are doing a pilot with UV rays on escalator handrails at Newark. We are actually testing 2 different crowd density apps that are working off of CCTV that alert our centers, that actually then deploy employees to go out and start moving crowds and making restoring the social distancing. So I'm not going to steal the thunder of Solomon, who has a lot more information about the innovative things that airports and airlines are trying to do. I will say this, so unfortunately, there are 33 states and 2 territories that are on the advisory list. And if we can go to the very next slide. So this is just a glimpse in our data warehouse. I work with some of the best data scientists in aviation. Rohan Iyer and Aya Manaka created this dashboard where we have information coming from reputable sources about the cases, the positive cases by state, and that is feeding this map that is when you look at the states that actually have a 10% rate, positive testing rate. Again, I'm running out of adjectives. This is quite disturbing. But what we are able to do is, as we feed these numbers in, these numbers reflect on the left are from the week of August 11th. And it then feeds in and tells us how many flights are coming from those states for the week of August 18th. And so that's what you see on the right. And at the bottom line, it's 2,365 flights this week are coming from those states. That gives us the opportunity to how to deploy staff. It gives us the opportunity to anticipate crowds, anticipate how the Department of Health deploys their staff throughout the airport. It's just a way of using technology and using information to actually help operations. And my very last slide, which is a huge thank you. And it's also you'll see a link as well as an address that you can watch our safety video. It's 2 minutes. It's telling you in detail about the things that we're doing in the airport to make the airport a safe means of transportation. And it also gives you a wonderful glimpse of what Terminal B, the new terminal at LaGuardia Airport, looks like. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Patty. Just to clarify, I think you said LaGuardia traffic it's down 75%, right? It's not
the ops are down 75.
Yeah, ops are down 75%, right? Why are the New York airports hit so hard? I mean, it seems like if you look at across the core 30 airports, based on our latest data from SysOps, they're down about 42%. But the New York airports are down much more. What's the...
Well, if you go back to May and April, the number of cases in New York and New Jersey was just astonishing relative to the rest of the country. And so as traffic did come back, it wasn't coming back here. Local residents didn't want to leave. They didn't want to go out of their house, and people didn't want to come to New York. And even if you saw when Delta restored international service, they restored it out of Detroit and Atlanta, not out of New York. So the Frankfurt service wasn't out of New York. Part of it was nobody wanted to even travel through the New York airports at that time because it seemed like it was a very, localized, the disease was very localized to just our region. Unfortunately, sadly, that wasn't the case. But the measures taken by our various state governments, taken by ourselves in the airport, and not allowing anybody into the terminal that didn't have to be there, making them wear masks. The fact that stay at home, that all helped, and it helped really curb the spread of the disease, and it helped to save lives. And I have to say, A4A, when they issued their study last week, they had a line in it that said that the quarantines and that the stay-at-home orders, how it really saw the decline in air traffic. And I'm like, you know what? It saved lives. So I stand by that.
So we have a question from the audience I don't quite understand. Maybe you do. How did you segregate the funnel airport traffic from the normal traffic? You know what that's referring to?
So that is a good question. Let me get back to you on how we did it. And it was, but first of all, there wasn't that much activity, and most of the activity was coming from those places for repatriation purposes. So I don't want to say it was 100%, that they were all from countries in Europe and China, and I think there were several other countries as well that were on that list.
Maybe one more quick one. How does the PA use the data? Could you say more about how PA uses the data on state infections that you showed at the end, which I think was very interesting?
What it does is it enables us to anticipate how many travelers are going to be coming through the airport on these various flights. We try to even encourage, for example, if you have two flights that are coming in around the same time at adjacent gates, we kindly encourage our terminal operators that they may want to consider of just gate separation so that you allow distance between people. So it helps us in operational planning. It helps us in telling the Department of Health, which greet most of those flights. It helps them in terms of deploying their staff. So it's just a demonstration of how we take this and use it to just improve the operations at the airport during this time.
Thanks. That's very interesting. Mike, shall we go on to the next poll?
Yes, let's have the next poll. Thinking especially about international air travel, what deters you most from traveling? The health risk of the flight itself, or the various travel restrictions and possible need to quarantine at your destination upon return? So the choices are: health risk of the trip dominates my decision-making, travel restrictions dominate my decision-making, both are major impediments. Okay. All right, one more second, and then let's close the poll. So 49% said both are major impediments, and the others are split almost evenly between the two, 28 for travel restrictions and 23 for health risks. So actually the travel restrictions are slightly higher than the health risks. So it's interesting that both of those are very, very weigh very heavily in people's minds, and all the restrictions may weigh even more heavily. Okay, let's move on to our third speaker, who is Solomon Wong of Intervistas. Go ahead, Solomon.
Great. First off, thank you very much to Michael, yourself, Joe Post, the FAA, NEXTOR, for the invitation to speak to this. I think the session that I'm going to run through looks forward in terms of what can we do into the future. So I've titled the presentation Future Proofing Airports. And I think it's critical to have the context both historically in terms of looking back at the past 20 years, that from SARS, MERS, Zika, now to COVID-19, we also have to prepare ourselves into the future in terms of where are some of the key directions that will cut across the business in terms of people, process, technology, and facilities. And dovetailing on Matt and Patty's comments as well, I think the ability to look past what we're currently going through from a range of different things, from data, process changes, adjustments, and of course, the eventual recovery to the industry, looking at scenarios around 25, 50, 75%, 100% recovery. And some of the things that you may have heard about from the last session for NEXTOR in terms of Brian Pierce's projections in terms of looking at where the industry stands. So I'm a firm believer that in order to look into the future, you need to also look at the past in terms of what have we dealt with before. So in looking at the past, it is 50 years ago, from July 1970, when New Orleans Airport became the first airport to use an FAA-developed anti-hijacking screening system. That point in time, in terms of looking at catalysts for change, was very much driven by weekly, daily occurrences of hijackings. And the reason I raise that is because it really had a narrative that one of the questions that came up on the chat window was just what are the international standards around responding to health screening or health measures. From the point 1970 started, it wasn't until 1972 when FAA published a rule requiring air carriers to be able to put together a passenger baggage screening system. And all the way until 1975, when the first ICAO Annex 17 was published with the standards set around security screening and aviation security measures globally. So when you look at that narrative in terms of time frame, we're very much in that period where there's obviously a lot going on in terms of ideas for solutions, but we also have to take a look in terms of how things are evolving. And it's going to take a couple of years for a number of the things that Matt mentioned in terms of the ICAO CART process that had a report in May. It started yesterday meeting again to be able to look at next steps. But when you look in terms of the past, it's also informative to look at how things evolved in terms of risk management. A great book that you should take a look at reading that may be a bit tangential to industry or academic related research is Alistair Gordon's Cultural History of the Airport, called The Naked Airport. And I've just put it in a shot of LaGuardia on the first day security screening came into place. And part of the change there really was a viewpoint in terms of a one size fits all, a pass or fail. Very similarly, around that point in time, when the 747 came into service, it prompted border controls starting at LAX to differentiate primary to secondary inspection processes as a catalyst for change, but very similarly in terms of a pass or fail type of approach. And through this time period, over 50 years, we've also evolved to a set of areas that are associated with a risk-based approach. So differentiating the flow of traffic from low, medium, high unknown risk. And so when you're looking at some of the conversations on what to do with data, what exactly is health screening or the kinds of solutions in place, you're also dealing with technologies and solutions. Whether you are looking at COVID-19 testing, a future vaccine, some have pointed to temperature screening. We're certainly dealing with not a single solution being fully effective. Temperature, for example, is effective in dealing with the kinds of things that are being looked at as far as the range of things that are advanced in terms of asymptomatic carriers of disease. And so just get sense so that I will just turn off the video given the amount of static and bandwidth that's come through for me. So please hear me clearly in terms of continuing the remarks. But the risk-based approach is really taking a look at separating speed of processing or how you're going to deal with the masses in the future. As we get of 50%, 7% presume, the inability of scaling up conclusions is something that is going to make sure we advance our methodologies. So the stage is just off my remarks enough. It's not getting my audio. in the internet space. So give me a sec if you can actually hear me.
Welcome to the
Yeah, we seem to be having a little bandwidth issues here, folks. Stand by. So, Mike, you had a good trip to Seattle. Is everything? What is your anecdotal report here on the state of air transportation?
I should tell everyone I flew back and forth to Seattle to meet my grandson, and you know, the airports were very uncrowded. My flight was slightly crowded. I did fly first class, so that felt very comfortable for me. I should say that I didn't get my, I missed a change in my flight's departure time, and I left for the Seattle airport exactly an hour before my flight took off. I got to the airport about 35 or so minutes before the flight took off. I was able to check my bags, make it through screening, and get to my gate in plenty of time. So I should just say that the lack of congestion at the airport is really a great thing. Should also say that the entire rest of the trip was incredibly quick. So it's amazing how a lack of congestion really improves.
Your microphone. You can press star 6 to unmute.
Solomon, can you hear us? Well, Mike, so there is a silver lining to a very, very dark cloud.
Yeah. I think I set a record, 6 hours and 45 minutes door to door from Seattle to Silver Spring, Maryland, which is in the DC area. I mean, one question I would have to some of the presenters is, you know, we see what we've all gotten used to coming to airports 2 hours before the flight time, et cetera. I wonder if, you know, with technologies and more investment or whatever, and that we can somehow reduce that, because, you know, we're all so concerned with flight delays, but somehow we've all been accustomed to getting to the airport super, super early. So,
Yeah, it's Patty, Mike. It's funny because the airports were one of their big sources of funding. I think Solomon's back.
Solomon's still having difficulty.
Oh, okay. So a big source of funding for airports is these ancillary revenues, such as concessions, parking, etc. And so the whole model for airports, and you've been through them, where it's that you exit through a shopping mall and you're contained in a shopping area before you're told where your gate is. And so it was about spending lots of time at the airport. And now the notion is let's minimize your time at the airport so you have less contact with others, with things. We're doing things like at your gate, where you don't even have to go to the concessions that do exist, and instead order online and it's brought to you. And so You're right. There's a totally different philosophy that's happening, but I would like to believe that this is a temporary state of being and not a permanent state of being, that, you know, once we have a vaccine and once the virus is abated and people have that comfort level and that trust to travel again, that it will I mean, I don't know if it goes back to, I don't know what normal is anymore, but I think hopefully it will be closer to normal than what it is today.
Solomon,
And
back
just to
with us?
dovetail on that point, if you can hear me now, thanks for your patience with the IT problems on my end for audio. But just to dovetail on that point, to continue my presentation, I think Patty's point is great around where we should be headed with the vaccine, but understanding that that's still some time off. And I think part of the argument I was making on this slide was a risk-based approach is what we've taken in the past in terms of every system that is dealing with a threat, whether it's border security, aviation security. You look at over 5 million members of global entry that are going to be classified largely as lower risk travel. Same with TSA PreCheck. Those are examples of being able to have the system absorb additional traffic. And a similar type of methodology will need to be developed to deal with the fact that we've got a number of risks that we're trying to take in managing and countering threats. As what's shown on the picture with Alistair Gordon's book, Naked Airport from LaGuardia, day one was not perfect in terms of magnetometers trying to deal with aviation security issues. So that will take time to run through. But I think the evolution of airports is really around how seamless touchless processing will evolve over time. Port Authority's video that Patty put in her presentation, that's in your chat window as well, gives a very good description of the kinds of things that have shifted in terms of plexiglass to contact points, touchless ordering of food items. And retail will definitely change in terms of being able to not have those contact points through the entire system. And so there will be a realignment of people, process, technology, space, and how you deal with risk management. The leading models that we're seeing are conscious efforts to figure out where the value proposition is for steps. So Candace McGraw was on an earlier call today talking about the role of infrastructure in terms of, at the current level of traffic, how do you actually keep some of that infrastructure alive? Well, one aspect is the elimination of steps. So a lot of the carriers moves to flip around the model where the notion of getting a boarding pass, whether it's physical or a code as well, that process needs to fundamentally change because the model could very well be pushing that boarding pass to an app on a phone. Similarly, leveraging mobile, PC Magazine had a study in 2019 demonstrating for each state, how many users are more iOS-centric versus Android or not a smartphone user. But there are many opportunities to leverage mobile devices in how we actually advance contact points. So do we see ourselves having an Uber Eats or DoorDash model growing into airport concessions and retail? Those are some ideas that certainly will capitalize on other distribution mechanisms that are also featured in the Port Authority video and other use cases. Privacy protected facial recognition is also something that starts to become critical. And I think on the ACI North America recovery panel, there's a lot of talk around, for some of the advances that have happened in terms of simplified arrivals, but a global view towards a one-stop facial recognition or biometric process end-to-end through the entire journey. We also are against the backdrop where cities of Boston, San Francisco, and others, due to the nature of mass surveillance type of issues in society at large, to the very narrow segment of identity confirmation that's really part of the journey now in order to get a fully touchless airport, so you don't actually have to touch or see face-to-face every step of the process. Privacy protected facial recognition becomes quite important. Interoperable track and trace health information is a very long statement. One of the questions that came up in the chat window was just what kind of information is out there, what's being used globally. So the interoperability of information between countries, but also more critically for a freight train that's coming our way. We think, of course, with researchers that there will be vaccines in use for COVID-19 in the next year. Well, starting in October, the Russian version of the vaccine is being pushed out. But it clarifies that if there is a viewpoint from the passenger that they are COVID-19 free, COVID-19 vaccinated, what traceability is there? Lufthansa, for example, has promoted the idea in terms of being able to take a test upon arrival within 72 hours, or have something that's certified by Ed Koch Institute in terms of being COVID-19 test free. That's an interesting view, but it clarifies the lack of global standards is something that is challenging and does need to be resolved in terms of who said that a passenger was free, because not all PCR tests and rapid testing are the same. Fifth area on the bottom, global preclearance. We saw Brussels musings in the past couple of weeks in terms of growing the U.S. preclearance model, and I think there's every argument to say that for the journey across international boundaries, that the more that can be done before departures as opposed to on arrivals is better for some of the issues we're dealing with. And then lastly, I think event-based notifications in terms of innovations for what the UK National Health Service has also advanced. 10.3 is an initiative that we're advising in terms of how do you actually put an app-based piece together. So in going through this journey, we also need to take a look at the pre-travel environment in terms of being able to purchase tickets or make a decision 365 days before the journey, all the way through to what happens after you land for 14 to 21 days. You can't also forget the hub and spoke versus point-to-point debate. Brian Pierce has also pointed to the actual break-even load factor level has increased just because of the additional costs of dealing with costs of cleaning as well as turnaround time. So the rebuilding of connection times in terms of what they were previously also need to be factored in the mapping of the customer journey. Much work is still needed in terms of at last count, 300 separate apps related to COVID-19 travel, growing at roughly 10 a week. 75 separate data requirements in North America alone, and at last count, over 60 countries that require some form of COVID-19 testing, in addition to what may be happening for individual countries at a subnational level, such as Alaska. So I think in dealing with this in closing, the changes are very much in real time. So as Patty pointed out, the data science aspect of plugging in APIs to be able to understand where we actually have levels of infection. If the EU has decided 16 cases out of 100,000 population is the bar for above which international travel is welcome back, below France making it back onto the quarantine list for the UK. We do have a patchwork of different things that are happening internationally, let alone within the United States, within North America. And so in closing, look forward to your questions, and thanks for your patience as we went through the IT problem of actually hearing me. Thanks.
Thank you, Solomon. Mike, perhaps we should go on to our next poll.
Okay. So the final poll is: suppose it was absolutely necessary for you to travel from New York City to Washington, D.C. next week. As a result of the pandemic, would you be more likely to make the trip by air, less likely to make the trip by air and more likely to take the train, or less likely to make the trip by air and more likely to drive? course, it would have been nice to have the results of this poll about 12 months ago and then compare it to the results now, but don't have that opportunity. Okay, a couple seconds. Why don't we close the poll? So a whopping 74% said they'd more likely to drive. 15% would fly, and 10% say they'd rather take the train. So,
no one wants to take the train.
yeah. Patty actually told me she likes to take the train down here, although I probably shouldn't say that. That
is an absolute falsehood.
Don't say that out loud.
That is an absolute falsehood. And no offense to Amtrak, it does its thing. I know Vice President Biden loves Amtrak, but no.
Okay.
Mike takes the Chinatown bus. Let's bring our panelists back on, shall we? I see Amadeo's on, and Yasenka, and all of our speakers. So I'll offer up the floor here to Amadeo and Yasenka and Mike.
Well, I'm not going to give, but each Amadeo and Yasenka, first Amadeo, maybe you can just make a few remarks and then ask some questions to the speakers.
Well, given the shortage of time, and I'm not going to make any remarks, but let me thank the three speakers for very stimulating presentations. I thought I would ask a couple of questions about financials and about governance. As Matt pointed out, revenue bonds have been the main source of funding capital investments for airports in the United States. And historically, these have been extremely, incredibly, I would say, safe investments in the sense that there has never been... Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, keep going. I think that went away.
So I was going to say that the airport revenue bonds have been incredibly safe investments, and there has never been in the history of aviation in the United States a default in an airport revenue bond, believe it or not. So my question to Patty and Matt and Solomon is, are we about to see a change in that? Are we about to see some defaults? And if that is the case, are we going to see a change in the way airport capital expenditures are funded?
Maybe I can start with that, and Patty and Solomon can chime in, but I appreciate the question. We're highly leveraged, but still sound investments. I think, I don't think we're going to see airports default. It's been a very bad situation. There is a recovery that will happen. The question is when. Airports are able to make adjustments to recognize the situation. But I think more importantly, airports have been amazing in the United States, very fiscally conservative. And we've been criticized, frankly, by other industry players for having cash on hand and that sort of thing. I worked for a while at MWA, and the example I would always use was 9/11. DCA was shut down for 6 weeks. And, that's exactly why airports keep cash on hand and bond covenants and all of that. Unfortunately now we have a much better example of why we do that. So I think, between that safety net, this fiscal conservatism, a recovery on the horizon, hope, medium term maybe. I think we're going to be able to avoid the defaults, but it doesn't change the fact that we're highly leveraged, and that's not good for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add to that, the Port Authority, it's a bi-state agency. We actually, by our Board of Commissioners, we have a policy of we take all the assets and all the revenues from all of our assets and put it in one pot. And it is really the strength of that is help. It's helped us all along because it always gave us a much more favorable rate when we did go out to the market. But right now, our tunnels and bridges are not actually in as dire position as we are. Our ports actually weren't cut, that didn't feel much pain, some pain, but not much pain. So right now it is the revenues from the tunnels and bridges that are actually helping to prop up aviation. And that's happened when we first took over the airports, and it's happened over time, but it is the consolidated nature of it that is actually what is helping us right at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to add to that as well, I think from a management standpoint of financial risk, there are also aspects where some airports are also critical as far as supply chain logistics and the cargo side of things. So certainly have financing mechanisms that are outside of the dependency on the passenger sources. I think there's some lessons learned in terms of the attempt for the St. Louis transaction at the end of last year. Now seems like a distant memory in terms of the pre-COVID-19 phase. But I think as you have a lot of activity to optimize operations for reduced traffic over the next couple of years, there will be some pressures to be able to explore alternate service delivery, capital delivery methods, as Port Authority has done with terminals, as you have other mechanisms as well to deal with future needs. Is that going to be in exchange for a per passenger fee for alternate sources? Those are some things that become important in terms of the realignment of where infrastructure and capital needs are for the industry.
Thank you. Continuing on this, as you know, there has been a lot of discussion about privatization of airports. And of course, in the United States, we do not have that. But in most of the rest of the world, we have seen a wave of privatization, especially in Europe. Has this crisis given us any, let's say, second thoughts about the privatization movement? How do you feel about this?
So in my introduction, when I was talking about Stewart Airport, I didn't say that that was one of the first privatized airports in the country when it was under through New York State DOT. That particular airport operator had a 5-year turnback and was planning to turn it back almost immediately. And the Port Authority actually took that airport back over, and it was unprivatized. So it's just an example of where that I think they thought it was going to be more valuable than it was, and fortunately we were there to take it over and have been investing in it ever since.
Yeah, and to respond to your question, I think that the conditions before the pandemic were probably more favorable for privatization, and I don't think they were favorable. The federal regulations really make it a difficult calculation, I think, to get to the return that most investors are looking for. It's unlike the rest of the world. So I think we'll see how the rest of the privatized airport world fares in this, and that'll be instructive as to whether or not it's more attractive in the United States. I think I don't think it's gone in privatization's favor, but again, we're at the start of this whole situation, so things can still change, and how the recovery happens, how the airlines, how our network looks after this will be a key part of whether or not privatization's going to be better off or not.
Okay.
Yeah, and then just a quick point to add to that, certainly in a down market where there will be distressed assets and those looking to finance and deal with acquisitions or the global market for where capital moves to, there certainly may be a spike up of activity. But in the long run view, I would agree with Matt that I think the ability to look at where that model will be advanced during the recovery period, still too early to tell in the U.S. market. I think for some multi-airport regions, we were just talking about Seattle when I was offline in terms of, Mike, your journey back in terms of some of the things that are looking at in terms of CTAC versus pay and field, how those kinds of models will evolve over time in terms of the use of private capital.
May I ask another one?
Go ahead, Amadeo.
Oh, okay. Hi, Josenka. Why don't I turn it over to you? Okay.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, Josenka, why don't you go and we can get back to
Okay, well, just have another face on the screen. So I wanted to actually go back and step back for a second and just refresh our memory that and reiterate that aviation is a very reactive industry. If we can all remember, it was in the 50s due to the mid-air collision that triggered the modernization of the air traffic control system. And then in the 80s, we had air traffic controller strikes that also created some kind of modernization. We have NextGen, which was another reaction to the delays and the lack of that. And September 11 tragedy actually resulted in the creation of the Transportation Security Agency, which worked very well and has been working very well. To the whole audience and the speakers, do you think that a new agency will be needed to specifically address pandemics in aviation?
I'll launch off on that. No, I don't think we need another agency. You know, pandemics and communicable diseases is not new. Solomon did a good job of covering the range that we've experienced just in this century. And so, you know, what I think has happened here is that the assumption I think before was that airports would act as the gatekeeper or the goalie. And, you know, I think the types of diseases and viruses that we were all talking about were much easier to contain. We didn't really spend a lot of time talking about what would happen if it got past the airports. So there are lessons learned here. There are agencies that have jurisdiction over this. You know, the FAA's DOT, they've done a great job, I think, you know, working on these types of things, public health, DHS obviously as well. So it's just, you know, like 9/11, there were, I think, things that could have been done ahead of time to have the response be better. That happens with a lot of things, and so this is no different. Again, we're not done with it, so there's more to learn, unfortunately. But I think we have the system in place to be able to amend and react like we do all the time.
Okay, and we just got a comment by Joe Post. If not an agency, maybe some other more, I would say, as Joe said, dramatic government intervention that will keep us all behave under certain standards. Mike Ball's favorite saying is, you know one airport, and that's how I also teach in the class when we study airports. But is there anything else that can be more efficient that could drive us to be, as the industry, more reliable and less prone to these types of events?
Well, I'll just
Go ahead.
maybe I'll just real quick just say, dramatic government intervention is not what we're seeking. I think actually the best solutions come when industry comes together. When we come together with the government, that's where we're going to get an effective solution, because we all have a role to play in solving problems. And a top-down approach is not going to work here. But sorry to step on you, Patty.
Oh, no problem, Matt. I was just going to say that whenever there's talk about more regulation, I get strangled more than any of the other partners in this scenario. And so that's something I'm not terribly interested, particularly when, cooperation could have gone a long way here. I do think there ought to be some giant after action, though. And that's like worldwide, where we really talk about how could we have done this better. And, it's no fault of science. It's, the guidance we got was the best that they had at the time. And we all, if you look at the early directives, were CDC was saying this was a low risk for the US. It was a low risk for airports. Not any fault of theirs. It was what they knew at the moment. It was masks are not really helpful. They're not necessary. That changed after they learned more. So I think and I don't know if it's at the ICAO level, I don't know where it happens, but a real after action that says, we did not do this well, world, and all of the people in it. So how do we do it better?
Yeah, and I think the answer to the question also in terms of creating yet another body is we actually must strengthen what we currently have and a greater role towards pushing for the global standard or the type of global standard that will be in place. The point I was trying to make with 300 separate smartphone apps in air travel alone is we have to remember the passenger can get eternally confused in terms of what they're supposed to do. And so even looking at what IATA thematic has in terms of the myriad of rules for when something is needed or something is not, it's not sustainable for what we have. Natural for the current reaction, but as the ICAO CART process gets underway again, as well as other arrangements like CAPSCA, ACI World Health Accreditation, I think moving to a point where we have to recognize that as international traffic has been disproportionately higher in growth rates historically in the past decade or longer, that is also the mechanism to also reinfuse the travel markets in terms of recovery. And you can't have that international traffic recovery unless you actually have a firm leadership role across how the global standard setting process will occur.
Okay, we have running out of time, but I only wanted to mention and go back to the history. I'm a fan of aviation history. In the early days of aviation, stewardesses were nurses. Do you think that having a larger number of other health professionals engaged in daily operations, like marshals originally on flights, can be our new reality?
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the issues is that this isn't a situation that's happening on airplanes or in airports, right? I mean, it's more people not traveling. I mean, people can be sick and travel and bring it somewhere else, but I don't see it as like somebody's coming down with COVID on an airplane.
But this was a symbolic.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think there is a lot of medical intervention in our industry to begin with. I mean, every airline has a on-call medical professional that can deal with whatever's going on. Airports have we're mini hospitals unto ourselves in many cases. So I think to Solomon and Patty's point before, all the structure there exists. Can it be improved? Yes. Do we need to work together to improve it? Yes. But this has never happened to us. So there are a lot of things that are going to happen. We just need to get through this first to figure out what the end state needs to be.
Could we maybe let Amadeo have a final comment or question, or just? Amadeo?
Well, I'm going to ask whether you think this is a bump in the road or we are going to see some dramatic changes in the future.
It's a bump, but it's a bump that lasts a while, but we will come back. And whether it's 4 years, 5 years, whatever that magic year is that we get back to 19 numbers, we will be back. I'm confident of that.
Yeah, I agree.
More or less in the same way that we have been operating now?
I would have to add that it will be different because now's the chance for some of the things that were pre-existing already in terms of innovation, technology, flexible facilities that will become even more important in terms of recovery so that we are able to get a positive legacy for what the industry is going through now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point.
I think our time is up. Joe, do you want to give a final comment or?
Thank you all for some interesting discussion there at the end. I wish we had more time, but we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. We will send out, which has not been scheduled yet, right, Mike? But we will
No, it hasn't, but it'll be in about a month.
We will send out a note to the list of attendees here and from the previous one and all the NEXTOR friends. So with that, thank you, panelists and speakers, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.